Today is the 8th of July 2020. My name's Barry York. I've been doing oral history interviews with participants on the Waterdale Road demonstrations in Melbourne that occurred in September 1970. So far I've recorded Ian Coulter, Robbo Bennett and Peter Cochrane, and I have a couple of more lined up. And the thought suddenly dawned upon me that I should really be interviewed myself because I was so active back then at La Trobe University. The problem is we're going through a pandemic, and also I'm recovering from surgery, and it looks like I might not get to Melbourne this year to record other people or to be recorded. So I thought I'll do this as a monologue, but I'll be using the basic question guide or pointers that I've used with Robbo, Ian and Peter so far, and will use with future interviewees. My intention is to donate these recordings to the La Trobe University Library in September on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Waterdale Road demonstrations, and also to other libraries. The main thing is to create this oral record. I've been involved in oral history for many years now, going back to 1984 when I recorded my first proper oral history interview. Back then oral history was fairly controversial, but I think it's now accepted by mainstream historians as having validity in situations where the events are within living memory. But of course, like any recollection, it has to be viewed cautiously. The same applies, of course, to any written evidence, historical evidence, or other evidence in print form. A good historian will always view it critically. But I think something that oral history can achieve, and what I think I've achieved with over 400 oral history interviews that I've done over the decades, mainly in the field of immigration history, it opens up the possibility of exploring the subjective factors. So today, in recalling the Waterdale Road demonstrations, I don't intend delving too much into the actual details of what happened on each of the three marches, but we'll certainly talk about the subjective side of those events and the context, including, how I feel about all that today. As for the factual details, I've written a Master of Arts thesis on the sources of student unrest using La Trobe University 1967 to 72 as a case study. There's a whole chapter about Waterdale Road in that draws on newspaper reports and so on. That was published as a book called Student Revolt, which I converted to a PDF, which is available free of charge online. It's well footnoted. And also, in the late 1980s, I applied successfully for access to police special branch. This is Victorian special branch records relating to the Waterdale Road demonstrations. And I was surprised at how much they released to me, and I used that material in a chapter in a book edited by Mark Finane on the history of policing in Australia. My chapter was called Baiting the Tiger, which is a direct quote from one of the police reports about the Waterdale Road demonstrations. I was fortunate that the Minister for Police at the time in Victoria was Race Matthews, who had been very sympathetic to the protesters on that march, and he may have even taken part on the final march in late September 1970. I'm not sure of that, but anyway, I found out many years later from one of his staff who I happened to bump into. They told me that I was lucky that he was the Minister for Police in the late 1980s when I applied for access to the special branch material, because other ministers for police might not have been so forthcoming with what they were willing to release. So anyway, all the factual, or most of the factual sourced material about what happened and when is certainly available in my book and in that chapter, and other sources too, of course. I begin by asking people to tell me about their background and their upbringing. Briefly, mine is that I was born in 1951 in London. My mother was a Londoner born within the sound of Bow Bells, which made her a Cockney. My father was stationed in London after World War II with the Royal Air Force, which he had joined in his native Malta. I have the surname York because my dad changed his surname in London in 1947 from Malac to York. So I was born in 1951 as Barry York. My parents migrated as assisted migrants by boat in 1954, and we joined my dad's brother, Joe, who was a waterside worker living in West Melbourne, and he nominated and sponsored us. Our first couple of years were spent in different boarding houses. My mother said that our first 22 months were in 7 different lodgings. The boarding houses were just the thing of having one room that a whole family would rent. There'd be other families in other rooms sometimes. These boarding houses were all in Coburg or Brunswick in Melbourne, and eventually we settled in Brunswick. In 1956 we put a deposit on our first house. I lived in Brunswick for 30 years. My parents were there for about 40 years, and it was quite a big thrill for me to be accepted to go to university. I went to Northcote High School, and I just scraped in. I just had the number of subject passes that was required for admission to a university, and La Trobe was one of the new universities in 1969 when I was admitted. I think the most sought-after university was Melbourne. I might have applied for that, I don't know, but I wouldn't have had the grades to get to Melbourne University. Now, I asked people what were their expectations of university and their objectives. Well, mine were pretty straightforward. I mean, I just wanted to become a school teacher. My dad, in particular, had always stressed to get what he called a clean job, by which he meant a job that wasn't in a factory. My dad in Melbourne, he always worked in factories his whole working life. And like many migrants, my parents wanted me to do better than they had done. They saw education as the way forward. I was the only child, I should point out. My mum had a late-term miscarriage before I was born, a year or so before, and that was a boy who died, I guess you'd say. As an only child, I was also a bit of a lonely child, I think, because both parents worked for wages, and I'd often be at home on my own after school. I was a latchkey kid, which meant they'd leave the key hidden for me, and I'd let myself into the house and have a couple of hours to myself before they came home. I think perhaps how this might relate to my later political activism is that when you spend a lot of time on your own like that, you become creative and imaginative. My outlet was art. I was awarded the art prize at Northcote High School in my final year for both my manual, the practical work, and for the theory. I loved the history of art and what it taught about the societies and how societies changed and how this was reflected in and sometimes pushed forward by art. But anyway, I wanted to become a school teacher, and that was what my father had always said. He said, be a school teacher, it's a respected position, it's clean work, and you get good holidays, it's good pay, and it gives you security of employment in the state system. So I was lucky to obtain a studentship, as they were called back then. This meant that you were bonded to the education department for 2 years after graduating. You'd do your degree, an arts degree in my case, and then you'd do your year's training to get a diploma of education, and with that you had to go anywhere that the education department sent you for 2 years. The benefit of the studentship was that they gave you a lump sum payment at the beginning and paid you, I think it was $11 or $12 a week, which was a reasonable sum of money back then. I first worked in a factory in 1971 for a couple of months, and I was earning $43, if I remember correctly, $43 a week. So the $11 a week in 1969 wasn't to be sneezed at. And I didn't have parents who were high-income people. They were both low-income earners, very hard workers, very good workers. But the fact was they didn't work for big money, and so it was important for me to have that studentship to enable me to go to La Trobe University in 1969. And I just assumed that in 1972 I would have completed my degree and completed the diploma of education, and then I would wonder, where would they send me to be a teacher? Would it be some remote country school? I was a total city boy. I loved and still love cities, and the thought of going to some country town really horrified me. But as things turned out, in 1972, instead of graduating, I was ended up in jail with Fergus Robinson and Brian Polar for contempt of the Supreme Court. But that's another story. Today I'm talking in this monologue about the Waterdale Road demonstrations. I also ask people, how and when did you become political? In my case, I think my father had a very big influence. He was very left-wing, very much a socialist, and sympathetic to communists. He looked up to people like Clary O'Shea and Ted Bull, and he had a certain scepticism about his own party. He was a member of the Labour Party. He certainly regarded the communists as more reliable in serving the interests of the workers and less prone to being corrupted by the system, because I guess they stood outside the system in wanting to overthrow the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, whereas the Labour Party were quite reformist even back then in the 1960s, when they still nominally adhered to a socialist objective. But my father was very political, very passionate, very intense. One of my earliest memories of him making a political gesture was when we were watching TV and there was a documentary about the Aboriginal artist Namatjira and the terrible treatment that he had been on the end of. And my dad sort of exploded in a rage and abused the television, because he was so upset by the way Indigenous people were treated. I think I became more independently political when I was in my mid-teens, around 1966, and there was a big case in Melbourne to do with the hanging of Ronald Ryan. So capital punishment was really the issue that got me motivated. I was at high school at the time. My father and my mother were both very much against the death penalty, and I attended demonstrations outside Pentridge Jail and sort of educated myself a bit with the arguments about capital punishment. My father had always referred to the case in England before we migrated to do with Timothy Evans, the Christie case. It involved this poor Welsh man who, I think he was a coal miner, who had gone to London and rented a room in this house owned by a guy called Christie. Murders had occurred of women, and Timothy Evans, couldn't really speak very well, and Christie being a landlord, a man of property, he was quite sophisticated. And to cut the long story short, Timothy Evans had been found guilty and hanged, and this was the early 1950s, I think, and then later on evidence was found that it was actually Christie who had been the murderer, and Timothy Evans was an innocent man wrongly hanged by the state. And so I grew up being aware of that kind of thing. My father was very pro-Soviet as well and would talk about, how healthcare was free, education was free, the old mansions of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie had been transformed into holiday accommodation for the workers. Like a lot of ex-servicemen, he looked up to Stalin because of the war experience, where he found that the communists in the Royal Air Force, he said there were Scottish and English communists serving, they all looked up to the Soviet Union as a kind of saviour against Hitler, and they were very good to him. He said he tended to be obedient, and if a superior officer would tell him, do this, do that, he'd just do it. Whereas the communist airmen took him aside and said, look, you don't have to do all that shit work they want you to do. Also, he found that they weren't racist like some of the other people who he served with. He couldn't believe things that were said when they were fighting Nazism and fascism, yet some of the men seemed of that frame of mind when it came to discriminatory attitudes based on race. So my father was definitely a big influence, and probably when I went to La Trobe in 1969, I was probably pro-Soviet rather than a Maoist, pro-China. I would have been sympathetic to both. I also became political at high school, and just for one example, state government, or maybe the federal government, the state government of Victoria had banned, under the Obscene Publications Act, a brochure about American war crimes or American atrocities in Vietnam. And this was banned, and even though I wasn't part of a student underground group, I was really one out, so to speak. I somehow got hold of copies of this banned pamphlet, and I very carefully distributed copies at school at lunchtime. I remember being very worried about doing that, but I felt that it was wrong to ban it and that the content needed to be known. Another little incident at high school, I persuaded two of my friends who were vaguely sort of left-wing, a measure of whether you were a bit of a radical or not was whether you liked Bob Dylan or preferred Elvis Presley back then. And these two guys were big Bob Dylan fans, as was I, and we'd talk about the lyrics and what the songs meant and all that kind of thing. But anyway, after the Olympic Games in 1968, and two black Americans did the Black Power salute from the podium after they had won their competition. And there was an Australian, a bloke from Coburg actually, Peter Norman, who came third, and he stood there in solidarity with them wearing a badge of solidarity. But that had a very big impact on me, as did the whole African American civil rights struggle. I felt very passionate and angry about it. And I persuaded these two friends of mine, my schoolmates, that at the morning assembly, when there was the whole school assembled in the hall, that when we were asked to stand for the national anthem, we should stand up and do the Black Power salute. And so I think I was pretty caught up in things, very political. This was all part of me becoming more political around 1968, when there was a global movement of solidarity. And while it wasn't just young people, it did seem that young people were the ones challenging the old ways, the old prejudices, the habits of the past, as well as being focused on the issues which I remember as mainly being the Vietnam War and apartheid in South Africa. They were certainly the two dominant issues in my mind, motivating me to protest. Another question I ask people is what attracted them to the militant left on the campus. I think with me, when my first orientation week in March 1969, I vividly recall a whole line of tables in Glen College near the dining hall, and these were everything from Christian groups to the young liberals and left-wing groups, and I think the China Society had a stall. And you'd walk along, it was like a smorgasbord of what did you want to pick. And I stopped at the Labour Club stall, and behind the Labour Club stall they had pinned up on the glass wall of the dining hall behind them the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And I was familiar with that document from my final year at high school. I even bought a copy, I think, from the International Bookshop in Melbourne, the Communist Party bookshop, and I had it on my wall, and I turned it into an artwork, which I still have. But anyway, that impressed me. So I wasn't so much, I didn't go there to be a militant. I expected that I would be active, I'd be involved, but I never thought I'd take any kind of leadership role. It just wasn't who I was, really. I was quite a nervy, insecure young fella. I wasn't good at much apart from art and maybe a bit of music. So I certainly lacked self-confidence and just thought that, yeah, I'll join in this stuff and, yeah, I'll join the Labour Club. But what attracted me to the militants within it, I think, was more to do with another campus, Monash University, where people like Albert Langer and Michael Hyde were identified as or with Maoists, and they were usually advocating militant action rather than just, writing letters to the local newspaper or having silent vigils. And that appealed to me because I was angry, I was passionate, and I had an intense personality or disposition. And I didn't and still don't do things by half measure, or rarely do I do things by half measure. Even with my musical interests, back in the 60s I became interested in black American music, especially blues, and it wasn't enough just to have a few albums. I had to dive right into it and seek out recordings by obscure artists, Big Boy Arthur Crudup and Little Willie Littlefield. And so I wasn't a half-measure type of person. And the turning point, I think, with being attracted to the militant people and the Maoists came through television. And I must stress that for me, television did have a big impact. Of course, I remember at the age of 11 seeing the grainy footage of the American warships and the Soviet warships during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I genuinely feared that there would be a nuclear war. And in my ignorance and naivety, I thought that a nuclear war would destroy the whole world, that the whole planet could blow up. But that came to me through television. You can read about it, but when you see it at the time, you see the ocean and the warships and the commentator saying that they're heading for a big confrontation and nuclear weapons are involved. Had a big impact. Also, there was the footage of, on the news, you'd see the black American civil rights people and the governor of Alabama or the police commissioner, whoever it was, ordered that the Alsatian dogs be let loose on these protesters. And to this day, I feel very angry when I think of that footage or when I remember it. You know, black people protesting for their rights, and this police commissioner letting the police use Alsatian dogs to actually bite them, you know, and not to mention all the batons and so on that are conventionally used by the police. So television really did have an impact on me in making me more aware and moving me to the left. There was also the hypocrisy of society in general that would come through the television, where on one hand you're seeing, you know, police in South Africa shoot down the black majority who want the right to vote, and then the next minute there's a TV show like Leave It to Beaver idealising the family unit in America. And that juxtaposition, maybe it didn't affect everybody, but perhaps my father's influence and the fact that I was also a rather sensitive young person, that also had a big impact on me. But a turning point for me via television was when in 1968 or 1969 the authorities at Monash University made what was probably a tactical error in calling a meeting to be addressed by the Vice-Chancellor, Lewis Matheson, at which all the student body would be invited, and there would be provision after the Vice-Chancellor's speech for students to get up and ask questions. And I was watching this at home on television and disagreeing with what the Monash Vice-Chancellor was saying, because, like I said, I regarded myself as left-wing. But the turning point came when, at the question time, this young, chubby, dishevelled-looking student, I think he had a beard and sort of wild black hair, thick rimmed glasses, he got up to ask a question, and instead of asking a question, he made a statement. The statement was witty, totally rebellious, completely irreverent to this authority figure who was up on the stage. But above all else, it was an intellectually tight statement about how the old world is giving in to the new world, and the time that we're going through will usher in changes that won't be able to be reversed, and that all the unrest is an expression of this. And I was flabbergasted at home. I mean, I'd been brought up, even though my dad was left-wing, my mum was pretty apolitical, but, you know, but both my parents had taught me, as other parents taught their kids, that you kind of respect authority. The police are there to help you. You always call your doctor, never call them by the first name. Your teachers are Mr. or Mrs. or Sir. And so seeing Albert Langer, which was this young bloke, dishevelled young man, challenging the Vice-Chancellor, just hitting him over the head with the truth from the viewpoint of the radicals, it just astonished me, and it really, in a way, it was a turning point for me. Now, I asked people also in my interviews about Waterdale Road what was the first action on the campus that they were involved in on the left. For me, it was in 1969, during orientation week, or mainly, or perhaps after, a little while later, there was a campaign to oppose the Melbourne City Council's implementation of Bylaw 418. That was a bylaw that prohibited the distribution of leaflets in the city square of Melbourne. And the Labour Club at Latrobe organised a cavalcade of cars, if I remember rightly, to drive into the city and to support other protesters who were defying Bylaw 418 by handing out leaflets. It was argued at the time that, people giving out advertising material for local businesses were not prohibited, and that this bylaw was an attempt to stop left-wing people using the city square, which we often used as a rallying point, prohibiting us from giving out leaflets advocating a stance that went against government policies such as on Vietnam or South Africa. So that was my first activity early in 1969, and I remember giving out these leaflets, and I don't think it was the police, it was probably Melbourne City officers of some kind, and they would come and take our names and tell us that we were breaking the bylaw. And one of my comrades told me later, he said, they wanted my name, and I said Karl Marx, and they asked, how do you spell that, But I don't think nobody was jailed over that, and eventually we did win, and we certainly gave out hundreds and thousands of leaflets in the city square. I'll continue to go through the questions that I ask others, and I ask, were they involved in organising the first protest march on Waterdale Road? That was early September. I should mention, though, before I talk about that, just want to acknowledge that in 1968, on July the 4th, after school, still in my school uniform, I must have hung around or gone to a friend's place or something, and then on my own I caught the tram into the city in order to be part of the 1968 July the 4th protest outside the American embassy. And it was a total police riot. It was incredibly dramatic. I suppose it was exciting on reflection, but at the time I was very fearful. It was very scary, especially when the police would use their horses and ride into the crowds. But there was great brutality on the part of the police. Now, I would think from the state's point of view, they were given orders to just make sure we didn't break into the not the embassy, the consulate in Commercial Road, St Kilda. And there were thousands of people there, and had we broken through the police lines, I think a lot of damage would have been done to the American consulate building, which was empty, I hasten to add. And one of the most dramatic memories I have of that time was when all of a sudden someone, a big burly looking guy, broke through the crowd, the police line, and went up to the flagpole, the top of which was the American flag flying high, and he cut the cord and brought down the flag. And you can imagine all the cheers that went up among the protesters. I found out later he was Dave Rubin, a waterside worker. Yeah, he was arrested. The other person to be arrested was Albert Langer. I forget the details now, but again it reinforced Albert Langer's status as a young person, a university person who was very courageous and incredibly intelligent and sharp when it came to the politics, the politics of Marxism, Leninism, and the Maoist development of Marxism, Leninism. He was really quite brilliant, and I should say is still brilliant, to show my current bias. But as for the first Waterdale Road demonstration, I don't remember being involved in organising it. But in doing these interviews and talking with other old comrades, I now believe that there was a meeting that was in one of the colleges in a room of Rob Matthews, the late Rob Matthews. I'm told that it was his room, and a small group of Labour Club type people were there, and they were wondering what kind of protest to organise in the lead up to the September moratorium. That was the second moratorium to be held. And I'm told, and the other interviewees confirm this, that there were two basic lines. One was what you might call a kind of adventurous attitude of having some small protest that would be militant and get some publicity in the newspapers. I think it might have been intended to do a sort of raid on the Department of Labour and National Service in Melbourne. When I say raid, I don't mean, physical destruction or anything, but I mean going into the building and occupying the offices or that kind of protest. But one of the comrades who identified, I think, with the Maoists back then, Robbo Bennett, he was at that meeting, and he felt that that was the wrong approach, and the right thing to do is always to try to mobilise the masses of people and to involve as many people as you can, rather than go off as a small group on your own. And he won the argument, and the decision was, well, we'll have a march, a peaceful march along Waterdale Road, leaving from the university campus, walking along that road, which was sort of partly semi-industrial, road with panel beaters and things like that. And then it becomes more residential the further away from the university you get. So I give great credit to Robbo Bennett for winning that argument. The aim of the march, as I said before, as I remember, was really to promote the forthcoming moratorium. The first moratorium in the CBD of Melbourne had been a huge success in terms of the numbers, and we wanted the second one to be effective as well. So I thought, let's have a local, suburban-based march from the campus. This would help us to link up with the community outside the campus, and also to try and mobilise as many students as we could. I think the first one was on the 11th of September 1970, and I recall how people aligned with the leadership of the Communist Party of Australia didn't support this idea of having a local protest march. I think it's important to state at this point that all of the dynamic in this left-wing movement of that period came as a result of internal struggle between progressives and reactionaries within the movement. And the people who wanted to push the movement forward and build it as a mass movement and connect it to opposition to imperialism and solidarity with the Vietnamese on one side, compared to others who were always wanting to tone it down, control it, and essentially use it for the electoral purposes of the Labor Party. And the Communist Party of Australia, the leadership were very much on the reactionary side, where they were our target in that kind of dynamic within the movement, which is not to say that all their members felt that way, far from it, and we were very successful in attracting some of the CPA rank and file people like Brian Polar, who fully supported the idea of a local march along Waterdale Road. But unfortunately the others, they did the wrong thing, in my opinion, and at the same time that we had scheduled our march from the campus, they had decided to put on an anti-war film in one of the colleges. You know, it really split the potential strength of that first Waterdale Road march. And we ended up a pretty motley crew of about 70 people lined up. But we were spirited. I remember there were flags and placards, but we had hoped the numbers would be bigger, but they weren't. And we still felt, well, we're going to march anyway. And unfortunately, the march didn't get very far. I remember we marched across Kingsbury Drive. I don't remember exactly how far up Waterdale Road we got, but it wasn't very far. And the police seemed to have it in for us personally. They were like thugs, you know, like people in a pub who don't like you and want to fight you. We weren't expecting it. We weren't prepared for it. We had assumed that we would be able to peacefully march and just do our chanting and wave our flags, Vietnamese National Liberation Front flags. But suddenly the police, they really went crazy, and they were very savage, and they had no hesitation in using boots as well as batons. And we, of course, ran away. We retreated back to the campus. There were arrests made, but all that kind of detail is in my book, Student Revolt, and in my chapter in the history of policing. I didn't experience any police brutality myself. I wasn't arrested on the first march or any of the marches, but I was pretty shocked and very angry that this could happen. It was sort of like being stunned, like a bit of disbelief, because we weren't being terribly obstructive or, you know, it was purely political, purely an attempt to stop these long-haired uni students marching. And we weren't all long-haired uni students either. When you look at the photos of people, sure, there are some that had the long-haired look, but others seemed quite conservative. One of the people on that march was a Christian by the name of John Warner, and he was also pretty shocked, and he wrote a leaflet just describing what he had seen. He probably had more credibility than those of us who were militant or Maoists or very left-wing, because he was a prominent Christian on the campus. So I think that's all I'll say about that first march. I do know that we went back to as we ran away and got safely onto the campus, I recall us going into the agora of the university, the central sort of square near the library, and I recall getting up with a megaphone and just telling everybody what had happened. Of course other people also got up and spoke, and I do recall people sort of coming out of the library, and the news of the police attack seemed to have spread, that something unusual had happened and what's going on, and crowds sort of gathered, and we certainly explained how we saw it. There was a bit of a myth at the time that Victorian police weren't allowed to come onto the campus because the campus was Commonwealth territory, but I don't think that holds much water. On the second demonstration, they certainly did come onto the campus grounds, not where the buildings were, but on what was then the paddock sort of area around the central campus. Anyway, we just were very, shocked and angry and determined that we were going to have the right to peaceful protest, to march. And we did our leaflets. By this time I was living and breathing politics. I was a fully activist. Of course my studies were sacrificed to a large extent, but on this particular issue especially, it was like, there's no way these uniformed thugs are going to stop us marching about the Vietnam War. And so I remember we had a Gestetner that we would print our leaflets on, and we'd do our posters, and there was probably a general meeting called. That's how we usually worked, try to build a mass-based protest about this. And more than a protest, an assertion of our right to peaceful marching in a street. Anyway, a second march along Waterdale Road was planned, and I remember that the right-wing students based around the National Civic Council and the DLP, B.A. Santa Maria's sort of supporters, and some of the left-wing, or what I would call phony sort of left-wing people. There were just a handful like that who said, well, the Maoists believe that you've got to create confrontation with the police so that it will radicalise the people who go on the demonstrations. And I certainly had no sense of that or experience of it, and I think by then I would have called myself a Maoist and identified with the Maoists at Monash, but we did have to counter that point of view of the DLP and some of the pseudo-left, that we had provoked the whole thing, and that was our intention. So with the second march, the SRC became involved, if I remember correctly, and we supported the use of observers. And these were neutral people who were not on the far left, but were sort of independent. I think the two university chaplains, or one of the two, Father Vince, they were both Father Vinces, but one of them decided to attend the second march as an observer. There might have been a couple of young Liberals who were observers too, and I guess we kind of resented it a bit because they had not supported the first march, but on the other hand we thought, well, there's nothing to lose, by this. But I don't think any of us expected the police to be stupid enough to attack the second march with even more gusto than they had attached the first one. The details of that march, as I say, are in my book, but I'm talking now about that subjective side. Like, I think we felt a bit of trepidation. What if the police did attack again? We didn't want to be beaten up or, arrested, but there was this definite spirit of resistance and determination that we were going to exercise our right to march along Waterdale Road against the US and Allied commitment to the Vietnam War, or aggression against Vietnam. And this second march with one of the chaplains as an observer and other observers, and this time the press, the media, had turned up. The police were more vicious. It was all filmed and photographed, and the police officer in charge of it all, Inspector Platfuss, he told one of the newspaper journalists that those protesters got some baton today and they'll get a lot more in the future. Many people were arrested. There were people hit over the head and over the shoulders with their batons, and it was really very intimidating to have the police behave in that way. I'd seen it before, of course, on the July 4 demos, but I really didn't expect it to happen in a local sort of suburban setting. And an important thing to note about the second march was that, again, when we started to run away to head to the campus, the police weren't going to let up, and they followed us with their batons. But also there are two established instances where they drew their guns. That's very serious. I don't know of any other protest marches in Australia at that time, in that period, where police drew their guns and aimed their guns at individual protesters. I'm hoping to interview Larry Abramson, who has given me a bit of information about how he was arrested on the second march at gunpoint. The policeman drew his gun about 25 metres away from Larry and just told him, "Stop, you're under arrest." Larry, I should describe as probably epitomised what the police didn't like he, long, lanky fella, always a big smile on his face, but this mass of hair, a hippie-looking sort of bloke who was actually quite political, a very staunch comrade, but they arrested him at gunpoint in the crowd, among the protest march while we were running away from them. The second person to be arrested at gunpoint on the second march was Peter Gavin, and I can give some direct evidence of that, because when we fled or tried to escape the police attack, we ran up Waterdale Road, crossed Kingsbury Drive. I'm talking of a few hundred people, here. It was a big demo for a local one. And we ran across Kingsbury Drive onto what were then the paddocks. It's now a big car park at Chisholm College, and we were all just running away, and the police followed us onto the campus, running after us with their batons drawn. And I happened to end up running away next to or near Peter Gavin, and I think I was faster than Peter, or more scared, and I was a bit ahead of him. And all of a sudden I heard someone call out, "Stop or I'll shoot." And I glanced behind me and saw Peter there, and I saw a cop in the distance. He was aiming something in our direction, and I just was so scared, I suppose, that I kept running. But then I looked back again, and Peter Gavin was on the ground, and the copper was running up towards him. I found out later that Peter had actually stumbled. He was not shot at. But I do recall at the time, I remember looking back and seeing, after hearing "Stop or I'll shoot," and seeing Peter Gavin sort of face down on the ground of the paddock, and I remember thinking to myself, well, hold on, I didn't hear a bang, I didn't hear a shot, and being a bit relieved. Now, if you listen to the interview with Ian Coulter, you'll hear where he was nearby on a mound in the paddock, as he puts it, and he observed all that, and I was very pleased to have some kind of corroboration of how I remembered it. And Peter Gavin was arrested. There were many injuries, bruises. I don't know of any broken bones, but people were very sore and sorry. The police would also punch you. Like I said, it did come across like they were thugs. And if you listen to Peter Cochrane's account of his arrest, you'll see how they didn't believe in one-on-one either. They were, like any thugs, they could be 2 or 3 beating up one person. I've asked other people about bail, like how did we raise bail? And I remember on one occasion going down to the waterfront, thanks to Ted Bull, who was vice chairman of the Maoist Communist Party, and also the leader on the Melbourne waterfront. And we'd go down there. I went down with a comrade by the name of Dave Mercer, and we went into one of the smoko rooms, and the union delegate introduced us to the blokes, who were, I don't know, about 30 or 40 of the wharfies there, and told them these were the young blokes who recently got beaten up on their protest march near La Trobe Uni. And I remember David Mercer getting up, and before he spoke he said, "Comrades," and the whole smoko room erupted with cheers and applause. And I thought, wow, this is pretty good. And of course, at the end of us talking to them, telling them what had happened, they passed the hat. And waterside workers are famous for their generosity to any worthy cause. And I know we raised some bail money through the Melbourne wharfies, through Dave Mercer and I going down there and talking to them. I didn't attend any of the court cases. Some people ended up with criminal convictions from that march. Fergus Robinson became the prominent leader, I think, at La Trobe, in large measure because of his courage on the second march. He was arrested, assaulted, and put in a divvy van from which he escaped, and that certainly gave him great status and kudos and respect that went on for a couple of years of his leading role on the campus. After that second march, the observers and the Liberal Party type students, they walked on the pavement rather than be part of the actual march, which was in one half of the street, but they were observers, and that established their neutrality. And they reported back, and the chaplain reported back, but there was all this evidence, overwhelming evidence, to disprove the baton over the head theory, that this was all manipulated by these evil communists who wanted a confrontation with the police, who provoked it in some way in order to make a point about the nature of the capitalist state, blah, blah, blah. And the Vice-Chancellor then really had to get involved. And there was a big general meeting called, I think, by the SRC. The Vice-Chancellor spoke, and he earned support, I think, from the student body by saying that he was writing to the Premier, Henry Bolte, to request a government inquiry into what had happened. Anybody familiar with Henry Bolte would know that he was an arch-reactionary who I still call him Hangman Bolte because of his willingness to proceed with the execution of Ronald Ryan in 1967 for political reasons, essentially. There was no way that there was going to be a government inquiry into it with Bolte as Premier. But what did happen was we organised a third demonstration because we were still determined, no matter how battered and bruised or fatigued. The core of us who were responsible for the organisation and promotion of the marches, we weren't doing anything for our university studies, I don't think, but we were very committed to this cause, the right to protest, and we were working day and night, on printing leaflets or talking tactics and strategy, painting banners and placards. And I think after the second protest, I should mention that the Summerhill Hotel was a bit of a gathering point for the left, and I do recall that there were a few tables, long extended tables, of people who had been on that demonstration, and we would gather there and discuss what had happened and what should happen next. After that second protest, or as we were running away, some of the comrades did stop and pick up stones as a defensive measure to stop the police or deter them or to slow them down. And when one of the stones was thrown, a truck driver was driving by along Kingsbury Road and his windscreen was shattered. The way we responded to that, in keeping with the Maoist idea of the mass line, that you clearly demarcate your enemy from your friends, and you're out to build a movement, not just engage in irresponsible sort of small group behaviour. What we did was we took the number plate of that truck, located the driver, and we raised money. We passed the hat around among ourselves to raise the money for him to be able to repair the windscreen. And I'm sure whoever delivered that money to him would have apologised too, and explained that we were under terrible attack and we were trying to defend ourselves. We didn't have batons. We thought that if we threw stones at the police, that would slow them down at least, and we could run to safety. The third demonstration was a resounding success. I don't know how many, 600, 800 people attended. I think it proved that what Mao said about reactionaries lift a rock only to drop it on their own feet. What had they achieved by beating us up and trying to deny our right to peaceful protest? All they'd achieved was that we built a bigger movement demanding that right, and we asserted that right by taking to the Waterdale Road for a third time. Again, all the media were there. Again, there were observers, but there were many more students marching, and also it had widened considerably, and there were representatives of Norm Gallagher's union, the Builders Labourers were there, and some of the wharfies turned up, and I believe some of the local people, including a few workers from the panel beaters, workshops and little factories along Waterdale Road, they also joined in on that third march. It took up much more of the road than the smaller, earlier two marches, and the police were ready, believe me. I remember seeing down a side street, and they had the horses ready, and they had their paddy wagons ready. So they were prepared for another police riot. But I think they must have also been told by their police commissioner, who would have got his instructions from the Attorney General. This time, you make sure you don't do a repeat performance. We don't want this to continue and to get bigger and bigger. And so the third one, we were quite jubilant at the end of it that we had succeeded. The police were intimidated into not attacking us, and we made our point. In the lead up to that third march, we had printed out a terrific leaflet, and I think it was Fergus Robinson who wrote it and had the idea for it. It was called Thank You. I have a copy somewhere, and hopefully it's in the La Trobe University archives. And we wrote it, or distributed it, to thank local people who lived in or off Waterdale Road, those locals who had protected us when they saw the police violence on that second march. And I know that one of the comrades was being chased by the police, and was taken in by a housewife in one of the, just one of the houses off Waterdale Road. She protected him, rescued him from being arrested. And the same thing happened with one of the little factories where somebody had run in and, the workers didn't give them up. They just let them stay there in safety. I was reminded by Robbo Bennett that on that 2nd March, the police, we had our megaphone, and the leaders of the march would have the megaphone to sort of rally the troops or to, quick go back to the campus or whatever. And one by one, whoever was using the megaphone, the police would just clobber and arrest. And it ended up that nobody had the megaphone. And outside the panel beater factory sort of area near the campus, Robbo reminded me that I, perhaps foolishly, I don't know, but I picked up the megaphone and I was trembling from head to foot. And but I picked it up and turned to the factories and sort of telling the workers what was going on outside, and Robbo thought that showed good form on my part, because everyone else who dared to use the megaphone had been clobbered and arrested. I don't know why I wasn't. Perhaps they were too busy beating up other people, or, as I said, lifting the rock to drop it on their own feet. The state and the police lost, and we won. We won that right to peaceful marching along a local suburban street. The other thing that the state achieved in their stupidity was that they really consolidated the militant left-wing people as the leaders of the student movement on the campus. In particular, those who identified as or identified with Maoism, Marxism-Leninism as developed by Mao Zedong. And then the stage was set for the following year, 1971. This movement with a militant leadership wasn't going to go away. And I think there was a reputational factor now that La Trobe was sort of superseding Monash as the hot point of radical activism in Victoria, at least, because of the Waterdale Road demonstrations, and that in turn attracted new students who were impressed with all that and who wanted to be part of this big global youth movement challenging the old ways and the capitalist system. And I think the alienation that people felt from the system was also a big part of it. I did feel nervous on that 3rd March. I thought the police might do a repeat performance, but it was the kind of nervousness where you really don't know what's going to happen. I'm not aware of any of us being prepared for self-defence on any of the marches. I know that on one of the July 4 marches, I rolled up newspapers and put them on top of my shoulders under my jumper or jacket, whatever I was wearing. And somewhere along the line we were advised to do that because the police would often hit you on the collarbone or on the shoulder bone. Sometimes people would wear their motorbike helmets in case they were hit on the head. I don't recall that we were prepared for self-defence other than running away, really, if they attacked us again. But it was seen as a big victory, and I think it is, for me, it made me more political, more impressed with the militant left-wing people and the Maoist idea of rebellion against authority. You have to remember that back then the dominant view was that you should be obedient and sure, fair enough to criticise things that you don't like, but rebellion was frowned upon. One of our Prime Ministers, John Gorton, around that time he had said, we'll tolerate dissent so long as it remains ineffective. Well, contrasted to that was what was happening with the Cultural Revolution in China, where young people were rising up and challenging the Communist Party or the reactionaries within it. Mao was the only statesman on the planet at that time to declare that it was right to rebel. Not that you should do it sometimes or that there are circumstances where it's right, but that in the interests of progress it's always right to rebel, and that that is essentially what Marxism boils down to. It is right to rebel. So that was a big political consequence for me, I think, of the Waterdale Road demonstrations, and it certainly turned me further into a kind of a person who lived and breathed political activism. I said earlier that I tended to have a personality where there were no half measures. I said with the music that I loved, like, for example, Nina Simone, I adored, and so I had to buy every Nina Simone record that I could afford. And I think with the politics too, that once I was convinced that we were building a mass movement that included in the leadership people who wanted revolutionary change, not just reform, that those demonstrations definitely reinforced all that for me and pushed me to take it all further the following year, which of course is another story, the struggles on the campus in 1971 and then the jailings in 1972. Finishing off now, I ask others, do you have any regrets about the Waterdale Road demonstrations? Well, I definitely do not have any regrets about them. I'm proud of them. In some ways it was our high point, I think, at La Trobe, though 1971 was also a high point. In 1972 the mood was very different. The ground troops had been withdrawn from Vietnam at the end of 1971 by McMahon. I mean, there were a few embassy guards and advisors left, just a couple of hundred troops of sorts were still in Vietnam, and Whitlam withdrew that tiny group. So 1972 was a bit different with mood, and we had a couple of thousand new students who hadn't really been part of the preceding militant struggles. There was a definite cultural shift with that new generation. But no, I have no regrets about the Waterdale Road demonstrations. I think they should be memorialised in some way. I don't know how that is best done. I'm hoping I'm making a contribution by doing these oral history interviews. That at least will create a subjective record that might be of use for a future understanding. Perhaps there could be a plaque of some kind placed in the Agora somewhere to mark the 50th anniversary in September. But I think with this pandemic, everything's pretty much up in the air, and I can't see that happening this year. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I certainly intend recording a few more people from back then. We're not getting any younger. Most of us are in our late 60s now or early 70s, so I'm very keen to do a few more interviews. I'm doing these just out of a commitment to the story being remembered, and I'm drawing on those skills that I like to think I've developed in oral history over many, many years. That's it from me. Be safe and rock on.